lovely to be here. It's great to see such a nice-sized audience. Thank you, Carol, for the very generous introduction. And I hope that you'll stay and look at the exhibition after we talk. I have 10 minutes to lay out the preceding years to NYCHA and NYCHA's early years. So I'm going to start my timer now. And let me see. Okay, it's going. All right. So what I will lay out here is where I'm operating, and Leo's going to take a more sort of technical look at the architecture and design. Is I'll be laying out kind of the principles of neighborhood and community, which really sort of drove these housing reformers and led to NYCHA, and then the kind of instrument they created, which was the housing authority itself. So, by the way, which is the? I want to hit the right button. That one.
Yes, right.
All right. So. Briefly, the housing reformers who created NYCHA were people who were steeped in the housing reform movement in New York. People like Mary Simkovich and many other people, Langdon Post. They had basically, they'd come up through a system where housing was this topic of enormous import in their circle, and they believed that it could be better. And in part, they believed that, for instance, the tenements, in part, had to be improved, because even though there had been decades of various reforms to housing, and there were improvements made from basically the extreme tenement blocks. I recommend Zachary Violet's new book on the decorated tenement. There were, the private sector did build better tenements over the course of the 19th century. The 1901 law led to the new law tenement. There were definitely improvements that had been made in tenements over the decades, but they were absolutely convinced that there could be another level of improvement in the city as a whole, because when we talk about the 1920s and 30s, by that period we have an era of decentralization, and yet the tenements were still there. They were in the Lower East Side. They were all around the city. And increasingly, you had gone from a state of basically overcrowding. If the problem of the tenement in the late 19th and early 20th century was overcrowding, by the 1920s and 30s it was obsolescence. Right? We have here the tenement fire, which you can see around the corner. We have an abandoned portion of a building. And we have this idea of substandard housing really being developed. The walk-up flat, the cold water flat. There were still, for instance, I'll go on. I don't have time to get into it. But, and they basically, the reformers, and this was an old tradition in New York, the reformers basically loaded all the problems of the city on the tenements. Fairly or unfairly. They found all the problems of the city came from the tenements, right? The crime, alcoholism, family breakdown, right? Fires, right? All these things. They basically viewed the tenements, even though there had been all this reform, because of the large areas of the city, even the 1930s, which still had tenement districts, they thought that this was something that fundamentally had to be remedied, and not in a small way, right? It had to be fundamentally transformed. These were New Yorkers. They loved to travel, right? Where did they go? Of course, to Europe. Almost all of them went to Europe, or they read about Europe in works by Catherine Bauer and others. Louis Pink wrote about Europe, and they were really impressed. Now, this is before, we'll talk about this. This really isn't the tower in the park yet. They were impressed with the kind of low-rise, or medium-rise at most, peripheral projects around German cities or English cities. And they thought that this represented a new kind of neighborhood, right? A permanent change, and especially in an era of decentralization, right? The city didn't need to be so crowded anymore, right? And this was leading the way. A country like Germany, for instance, which you see here, this could be done. And how was it done in Europe? It was through either a limited dividend model with government support, or direct government action in Vienna, London, and elsewhere. So, you know, you can see a governor. I mean, this is, you know, I guess maybe it's not so weird today when we think about healthcare being talked about, you know, European healthcare, right? You know, let's bring European-style socialism, healthcare here, right? Here we have the governor of New York State saying, hey, you know, this is how they do it in Europe, and we should do it here as well. There were attempts before there was a public housing agency to kind of implement some of these ideas, to take some of the really great apartment house designs which had been developed for, let's say, market or higher income people, apply some of, or the garden apartments out in Queens in the 1920s, and apply these to philanthropic housing for working class tenants. But the problem with doing this as a limited dividend in the United States was there wasn't funding to help them build, really. The Housing Act of 1926 in New York, the State Housing Act of 1926, didn't really provide much funding. So this laid the groundwork in part for that public solution. The other big piece, which often gets lost in the origins of NYCHA, was that people like Mary Simkovich founded Greenwich House. When there were others, they were directly engaged in neighborhoods. Right? And when she writes about, well, we did what we could at the settlement house to improve people's lives, but then the kids went home, right, to the tenements. So there was this in their minds like, well, let's take care of home now. Right? And there was this kind of domestic urbanism, or whatever you want to call it, right? This kind of housekeeping, or urban housekeeping, and the healthcare programs, early education, and so that also is sort of driving them, and it's driving them towards public housing. So the crisis of the Great Depression, right? They've been working for decades, and that's never worry if you don't achieve your goals straight out. Public housing, these housing programs were the result of decades of activism. And the crisis of the Depression offered the opportunity where New Yorkers were suddenly, sort of pulled up to Washington, D.C., right, to serve in the New Deal administration. You have Senator Wagner having enormous power. Catherine Bauer, this great housing expert, brought into D.C. to consult. A lot of New Yorkers. Nathan Strauss ran national public housing programs for many years. Nathan Strauss Jr. All right, so these reformers had their opportunity. The private sector was on its back, right? There was a need for employment, right? But they didn't really care that much about it. They did, but they were in it for housing, right? So they used the New Deal programs to basically generate their new kind of neighborhoods. So to do that, they had to create a new machine to pull that off. And people talk about NYCHA as a thing, but really NYCHA is a set of laws. Right? It's basically a state-enabled public benefit authority, right, with a series of powers delegated to it to this day, right? Amongst them were data collection and studies, which you'll talk about, the kind of studies which were generated, eminent domain. That was radical, right? In fact, NYCHA would have to defend this power in its first project, its first house, its ability to take private land from owners and give it to someone else. It could finance housing, it could issue bonds to basically finance housing, could plan and design projects, right? It could develop those projects and hire contractors, and then it could even manage these projects. And this was all on this public side. So it was enormously powerful, and I love this sort of image. Here are the tenement blocks, right? And here is sort of the idealized version, right? The clearance and replacement with this new kind of vision of modern housing. Right, I have 2.5 minutes. So here we go. What are these apartments like? Well, obviously, housing is really crucial to them. Window in every room, light, air, modern heating systems, elevators eventually in Queensbridge houses. It only took a few years to get that, right? And the idea is to basically also control the tenancy, very carefully move people, families, check them out, visit their apartments, make sure they're good housekeepers, right? And move them into this utopian new neighborhood. Right? The early experiments, right, like Harlem River houses, which still is a very beautiful project today, they have actually a lot of connections to housing, the philanthropic housing which went before. There's still walk-ups, they have these courts, but they're not sort of spread out over like enormous numbers of acres. And the whole idea is that they do have a super block. They do merge, essentially, blocks, but the spaces are programmed for specific uses, for sitting or playing and so forth. So there's a kind of quality to these first projects. And in fact, the other thing they had, these first projects, this is the idea of the neighborhood, and I want to stress that as much as possible. They had stores, actually a fair number of stores. They had community facilities built in, kindergartens, right, and so forth. So, even though, because they had income limits on who could get in and if you even could stay on income, even though there was some sense that people would move through these places, these were permanent new neighborhoods, right? And look how they've lasted, right, over these years, 80, 90 years old. So there is this idea of permanence built into these kinds of communities. And they do have a kind of, what's interesting about the first projects, the first houses in Harlem River, they have basically walkways that connect to neighborhood streets, right? The retail itself is a good connection, and they're definitely permanent neighborhoods. And even Queensbridge, which you'll talk about a lot, you can still see where the reformers and their idea of community is still there, right? It's still powerful. because at the heart of the Queensbridge community, what did they put? They put community facilities and a shopping area. Right? All of this will go, it won't be around in later NYCHA projects, for instance, but there is still this almost like a garden city idea, right? You have these little cloistered green spaces, it's set out in its own landscape, and yet there is kind of a community idea and a community center to it. And I would argue again, too, or to show you again, that people like Mary Simkovich, who becomes the vice chair of NYCHA in the late 1930s, even though there really wasn't enough money to build community center, or actually to staff community centers, she insisted that they be developed, right? And then LaGuardia, who I haven't even mentioned, right, he was an enormous fan of public housing, and he wanted to see facilities like baby health stations and libraries and so forth. So public housing begins in the 1930s. It's an extremely powerful organization, but at the same time, there's a kind of, it's not tenderness or something like that, but there is a sensitivity to community design and community life, which is the idea that we're building places which are going to be part of this city for decades, right? As such, they can't be sort of this monofunctional sort of, housing in this sort of open space. So,
I'm going to take a look at the more design perspective. About the origins and principles of NYCHA site planning and design as kind of a different track to follow and trace back this history. So in this sense, I want to start just by comparing these two photographs, these two actual renderings. This is model over here, because there is this idea that NYCHA developments and Robert Moses developments, etc., are kind of influenced by European modernism. And while true, this is not the full story, right? This image over here is from the Plan Voisin by Le Corbusier in the 1925, where he basically proposed for the first time this idea that there could be a series of very well organized giant towers in the middle of a city as consolidated as Paris in this case, right? And there you have a late 60s NYCHA project, Polo Grounds, which looks astonishingly similar to the Le Corbusier model. However, these are very different, and there are very different reasons behind them. To start with, these towers are office towers. These are apartment buildings. Also, these are meant to create wealth in the middle, in the very center of Paris. These follow a rationale of more cost efficiency, you could say. Also, this is some sort of utopian view. Well, this is a very institutionalized strategy and approach to design. So, also this is all glass facades and this is all brick, which talks about a different tradition and culture of design, a more neo-Georgian type of design coming out from the 20s. So, we're trying to look at this one, the NYCHA culture of design, looking at the origins of all it. So, not simply by looking at European modernism. Now, the origin of it, if you go back to the industrial cities, the slums and Thames, as Nick has already mentioned, and as early as 1845, you have Engels in his critique of the slums. He's already pointing out two main architectural issues that illustrated, in his view, the greed of the builders at the moment of these industrial slums in England. And these two issues were one, poor quality of construction, and two, lack of open space. They were, the footprint of these buildings were covering too much land. So, of course, later reformers, housing reformers in the turn of the century, took that as the enemy, the land coverage of housing development. So they basically thought that the solution to the slums problems was open space as opposed to high land coverage. Here we have Raymond Unwin, who happens to be a very relevant figure for our history because even though he was British, he came to the United States to work as a housing consultant, and he also taught planning at Columbia University. And he had this model of low density development designed basically for the outskirts of the city, the expansion of the industrial metropolis, where he basically pointed out that having larger blocks and plenty of open space in the middle of them, you could not only achieve a more agreeable environment for living, but also be more cost efficient and developing more economically, because he pointed out if you build this way, you have less infrastructure to take care of because there are many less roads and less infrastructure in general. So you can build cheaper per acre that way. Of course, that was true in the outskirts of the streets, in the other boroughs of New York, Queens, for instance, where you had plenty of cheap and available agricultural land, but it didn't quite work for the center of the city, right? Kind of also in the outskirts or in the outer boroughs, you had this other model, which was the garden apartment, where you had architects like Andrew Thomas, for instance, pointing out that by building more compact and covering less percentage of the land, you could actually be more efficient in terms of space, and you could build cheaper because construction was simpler if you have more compact buildings, and also you could ultimately sell your apartments or rent your apartment cheap for high prices, right? So it makes sense economically too. So we really see kind of an approach to this model of lower density housing, which is based not only on the desire of being uncrowded and having lots of open space, but also supported by economic arguments. Of course, in Manhattan, for instance, the situation was different because land was expensive and there were already in place dense blocks of tenements, so there has to be a different approach. So in this case, we see a lot of rehabilitation in the 20s, attempts to kind of carve out light courts in these old tenements in order to improve the conditions of light and ventilation. First houses by NYCHA, the first project attempted by them when they came to be, as well as the work public administration, they tried rehabilitation. And this project, First Houses, was kind of the evidence that that was a difficult approach because it was very costly. So rehabilitation came at higher cost in general than redevelopment. So they started trying to rehabilitate old tenements, but ended up tearing them down and only reusing the foundation. So it ended up being a new building. Now the architect behind First Houses was this man, Frederick L. Ackerman, who was an advocate, a housing advocate and expert. We will talk about his background more in detail afterwards. But basically, he worked for this project and he ended up being the head of the technical division at NYCHA the very year it was created. So when he got in that position, he who had been a kind of a housing reformer in his own way, started to study and analyze how they could move towards a lower density model of housing for the projects that NYCHA would produce. First thing they did, he and his colleagues at the technical division, is they studied housing types of New York. And they even produced an exhibition where they compared different housing projects in New York. This one, for instance, London Terrace, which we have also analyzed in our exhibition. So, but there were many others, and they looked at different factors. They looked at lot coverage, they looked at height, at population density, etc., in order to establish their own parameters. So in 1936 and 37, they produced and published this report. Both Ackerman and his assistant at the moment at the technical division, who was William Ballard, they produced this report where called a node on site and unit planning, where they basically set the parameters for all NYCHA developments in the next subsequent decades. So they looked at population density, they looked at lot coverage, they looked at height, and also cost of not only construction but also maintenance, right? And they established kind of a range of possibilities that went from, for instance, in terms of population density, from 125 people per acre to 250 people per acre. Lot coverage from 26 to 35. So it was a range, but it was clearly narrowing down what the authority wanted their projects to be, right? So it was this idea of lots of open space and low density. They also looked very carefully at sunlight and ventilation as kind of key factors in their design. So they did a lot of studies comparing different types of housing and buildings and analyzing how much light they got. Because ultimately what they wanted is to maximize the amount of sunlight and ventilation that every unit got. These are some designs of a series of units around a circulation core for the early project of Queensridge houses. This was the first approach to that project. And so you see different modules that would then be repeated across the site in these ways, but basically they were trying to give every unit enough, every room as much light as possible, and every unit, when possible, of course, ventilation, etc., etc. Now, the project ended up being this instead, which is kind of a development of that same rationale, where they understood that if they adopted this Y-shaped design, then they could, the units would get sunlight more evenly, and they would produce at a minimum the common space, so that was more efficient in terms of space use, use of space, and also they could repeat the same model all across the site, so they would need, theoretically one model that they would repeat across. Now the person to kind of behind that change was William Ballard, who, as I said, was a assistant of Ackerman at the technical division, and he was over here because he also oversaw and kind of designed the project. Here's the project under construction, and here's this spread of the New York Times by 1940s, showing all the different projects that NYCHA had developed. Queensridge, you have Harlem River houses, you have Ballard over here, you have Williamsburg, and of course the title is New Places in the Sun, very appropriate for the kind of mindset that actually created these projects. But interestingly, this set of initial projects kind of shaped, in my view, the mindset, at least of the designers, including Ackerman and Ballard, in a way that they kind of took some conclusions out of these experiments, early experiments. So, in my view, one of those conclusions was that in order to kind of push to the maximum the amount of open space and sunlight, etc., they kind of push it from 75% of the open space, 75% of the land as open space to maybe 80 or 85% of the land as open space, they really had to move into high-rise. Otherwise, if they kept, with these models, that was really tough. They couldn't, reach the number of units, etc. They were trying to achieve. So, and the other conclusion that is very important in this case is that in order to reduce the cost of building these developments, which again, this is after the Depression, so I think during and after the Depression, so it's very important to have to be cost efficient. They did have to first build large scale, because that way they could economize their their construction sites and their cranes and everything else that was implied in these projects. They also had to standardize, because standardization was also key to achieve cost efficiency. And ultimately, if they built higher, they were also more efficient in terms of how they use their elevators and reduce all common halls and common spaces. So as early as 1939, when Queensbridge was completed, we have Frederick Ackerman writing this memorandum in NYCHA saying something like, let me start something like, I think we should push the efficiency of the elevator and public halls up to the maximum, which has been pretty well established by experience as reasonable. I would like at this stage to abandon anything in the nature of enclosed courts and long rows. In this way, it is possible with such densities to approach maximum in respect to a free circulation of air about the buildings and throughout the project. So they moved towards the tower in the park model based on this rationale. They wanted to achieve the maximum amount of open space, but also reduce the cost as much as possible.
So I think that Leo has laid out a very compelling case that the technocrats want. The sort of community-minded idea, which housing sort of begins with, and really sort of grew out of the settlement houses, right, and the neighborhood ideas and so forth. That basically loses, and it loses in part for a number of reasons. I'll get to this guy in a minute. Technocratic vision aligned well with the legislation as it developed in the Housing Act of 1937, 1949, 1954, which basically mandated economies, right? I mean, you understated it to a certain extent, but there were extreme limits basically imposed on public housing in terms of cost, which made it very difficult to basically create a more, for instance, a broader community vision of community facilities, but even also architecturally. Definitely emphasized repetition of buildings, minimal basically decoration of buildings, and maximization, for instance, of elevators, for instance, regardless of whatever the social perspective was. And your talk made me remember actually a quote from one of the early managers of NYCHA housing, and she said it was in I think it was as early as the early 1940s. She went and visited 4 greenhouses, and she says, "We should abandon the elevator type for families." In the early 40s, nobody listened, right? In essence, right? Because they were seeing on the ground that already there were definitely issues around, for instance, families in elevator buildings, for instance, in elevators, automatic elevators. So this technocratic vision comes together with federal policy, and of course Robert Moses, he didn't really get control of the housing authority until the mid-1940s, but when he did, right, here was this tremendous opportunity. He aligned himself in many ways with the housing reformers, but he didn't ever like public housing. He was not a fan of it politically, but he needed it, right? He needed it for his highway programs, for his reconstruction programs. If you open up any Title I report, there's like a percentage. It says, we'll put 18% of everyone on the site into public housing. Whether they did or not, hard to say, but he absolutely needed it, right? And he was a technocrat himself, right? So he could see that public housing was this enormous opportunity to rebuild the city, but he didn't have the same social vision. He pushes out Mary Simkovich, for instance. He didn't have the same social vision. And he was aided, while I agree that, Corbusier, for instance, is not a major factor in 1930s public housing at all, right? But certainly what happens the way that NYCHA operated is not only did it not actually directly build its own projects, that is, it hired prominent construction firms, but it hired architects, theoretically, to design its projects, right? And so the, all of the research that Ackerman had done, but you know, it kind of nicely parallels, right? There are obviously differences between a commercial building and a residential building, or glass-coated or brick, and so forth. But these firms like SOM, which were hired to basically design NYCHA projects, you know, they're part of that international conversation which was dominant in architecture and planning in the post-war years. And so everything kind of comes together, right? The research of the 1930s, the way the funding streams are set up, and these global ideas that, you know, this was really an ideal urban housing type. And so almost all of the post-war housing projects in New York will be a kind of typical tower in the park. They range in heights, you know, where the land costs were low in the outer boroughs, you know, it might be 5-6 stories, but other projects in Manhattan were often much taller. They had in common as well a slum clearance. Even in this period, the housing reformers have been pushed out, but this vision of obsolescence of tenements was still there. And so there was massive, hundreds, if not thousands of acres cleared to make way for projects like Carver houses, which you see here. And in order to kind of get those open spaces, which were kind of the requirement, if you will, from both the international idea and what Ackerman had developed, streets were removed, right? Help to create these super block spaces, because you could kind of carve super blocks out of streets. The buildings did get taller with elevators. The entries, there was still this sort of fear of the surrounding neighborhoods, so very often the entries for the buildings, they didn't face the streets, right? Because that was scary. You know, that's the tenement neighborhood of East Harlem, right? This was the carefully selected tenancy, right? So you go into your development. That might be one of the last legacies of the community idea, right? Is at least you would know who lived inside that product. You would go inside there and you would be safe from the street outside. There was a lot of greenery, right? This is still the one sort of luxury, right? Greenery and open space around the buildings. Increasingly in the post-war period, particularly in the outer boroughs, but in Manhattan too eventually, parking lots were included because public housing served a relatively wide range of tenants in this period. Many of them might have wanted their car. Then the zoning requirements post-60 also mandated it. What we don't see in the post-war projects, we don't really see much in the way of stores, right? We don't really see those connections to communities. And, you know, partly that's economizing, that's a big piece of it. But the other side was that in the 1950s, the federal program prohibited stores in public housing, all right? But the state program didn't. And yet you still don't see a lot of you don't see a lot of stores in state-sponsored public housing or city-sponsored public housing. And I think this gets back to Ackerman's view, which was still very influential. The Technocrats had won. It wasn't about building, really wasn't about building community, it was about housing, right? And primarily housing. And, you know, nobody was paying, the other side of it is even the state or the city, no one was paying to build those stores, right? And NYCHA had a lot of problems around managing stores, still does, right, to this day. But, you know, that's an enormous loss, right? And I think we talk about, you know, public housing very differently, for instance, if it had stores all throughout. And I would add there's one other problem also with the modernist idea of the city and these towers set back from the street, is that where do you put the stores, right? You know, that it's such a dominant design. If air and light is so important, it's kind of hard to figure out, and the buildings are set back. Is that going to work as a retail idea? It might, you know, but it certainly didn't encourage it. And, you know, the scale of the system is just tremendous. 69, by the mid-1960s, 69 projects over 1,000 units each, right? This is why it's so hard to sort of imagining redevelopment and so forth, because where do you find another, you know, just to replace one project, 1,000 units for the families there. And you'll see the concentrations, you know, basically follow the paths of where a lot of the tenement neighborhoods were, right? So this was an extremely powerful vision that through basically federal, state, and city funding was able to build an unparalleled system in the city. Now, by the late 50s certainly, and certainly by the 1960s, there's enormous criticism of the massive demolition of neighborhoods, right? To get all that open space and greenery and sunlight, right? Stores were being knocked down by the hundreds, right? Neighborhood facilities were being lost, right? And there were questions about, well, you know, when it wasn't such a carefully selected tenancy, maybe having, you know, for instance, the entrances on the inside of the block wasn't a great idea. And there were attempts, and these often get lost in sort of the story of NYCHA, but there were a lot of sort of scatter site or vest pocket, as they call them. There were a lot of smaller projects which were inserted on a kind of opportunistic basis. Like find a spot and put a project, and these were often a little bit higher density because there wasn't as much greenery around them. But this is kind of the end, right? By the 60s, there's an enormous turn against public housing as a program nationally. In neighborhoods, there was enormous resistance to additional public housing because they overloaded certain neighborhoods. The middle-class neighborhoods didn't want it, as we know from the Forest Hills debacle in the 1970s. They resisted public housing in their neighborhoods. So that really brings the housing program to an end. But what had they done? You know, 176,000, you know, apartment units created, right, in just a couple decades, right? You know, thousands of acres cleared for public housing, right? And obviously there had been things lost. Ideas of community were lost. Community planning, a lot of that was lost in the march towards efficiency. What is the legacy of NYCHA, you know, on the tower blocks today? You know, we have, you know, parking lots, for instance, as a low-cost urban amenity in the middle of the city, right? That's something that, while community planning, you know, that could sort of be preserved in some ways, except maybe a community center here and there, right? Parking lots, right? That is sort of one of the legacies, right? There are some, you know, positive legacies, certainly, for people who live in these tower blocks, right? They look out, you know, if you look over here at our models, right, you'll see the units, you know, the Taft Houses model, right? These apartment buildings, as Johnson Houses model, they're relatively large, they're low cost in a city that's become very expensive. They have views out over air or over airy lawns and trees, and people know it, right? They know what kind of value they have in these places, and it is not to be underestimated at all. There also is the tree canopy itself, stretching through the city, in a city that is increasingly built up. There's a kind of greenery that threads through the city, and it's worth thinking about the value of that not only to NYCHA residents, but certainly to the city as a whole, especially in an era where we want more water, you know, sort of to percolate into the ground as opposed to paving everything over. But obviously there are issues, right? The sort of the loss of that kind of integration of projects better with neighborhoods, the changing sort of tendency of public housing, the lack of funding over time, but also crime issues that developed in neighborhoods and developed in housing developments themselves, right? These developments have been retrofit in ways which aren't really very attractive. It's understandable why it was done, but whatever community element that was often left in these places, and people have a strong sense, I think, of community and identity with the individual developments, a lot of that is undercut by a lot of the tough decisions that had to be made to basically protect people, right, through cameras, various forms of sort of arming buildings for defense. And so that is, you know, sort of, you know, you go from this sort of community model, right? It's in essence, it's too bad, right, that community vision didn't become the big vision. I think we have a very different view of public housing, right? If the initial projects were really sort of the model, right? Maybe 6 stories maximum, right, across the city with shopping and community facilities integrated. So,
all right, so finishing now with a more monographic presentation of on some of the, basically 2 important figures of the story from the side of design and inside planning. So, and as Carl always said before, this is part of a shared research that started in parallel and also kind of trying to feed the exhibition efforts, and is still ongoing. So, we're discovering and uncovering more about it. So, what's very important I think, to the moment we're talking about is that it is the depression that triggers all these experiments, public housing, and also that allows certain people like Frederick Ackerman, for instance, to implement their ideological approach to housing in a way that a normal, regular economic situation would have never allowed. And so, in the case of Ackerman, it is particularly technocracy that is really driving his mind. Ackerman was a very important housing expert since the late 10s. So he studied at Cornell and also Paris. He started his own firm. Afterwards, then he also traveled he was literally everywhere housing was being discussed, right? He went to England to see their efforts around housing there in times of war. He wrote this book when he came back, Housing, Power and War and Peace. He also was part of public debates. So in this case, this publication is transcribed a series of discussions between Ackerman and Elmer Wood and John Murphy around the necessity or not of having public housing, actually. Interestingly, Architectural Graphic Standards, the well-known famous handbook for architects, was written in Ackerman's office by his own staff. So Ramsey and Sleeper were actually Ackerman's employees and drew the plates for this publication in his office, so he was involved in all that too. But the core of it is his belief in technocracy. That is his ideology. So Ackerman met earlier in the 10s. He met Thorstein Veblen, the famous economist and advocate of technocracy, who basically harshly criticized the capitalist system, which he called the price system, and defended or promoted the technicians should take over and kind of manage society according to technical principles. So Ackerman met Thorstein either at Cornell or at the New School, we're not sure, but he was definitely a follower of Thorstein. And so he went on and co-founded or co-initiated several initiatives around technocracy. In this case, is a Technical Alliance that he co-founded in 1919. That didn't live long. Of course, the 20s weren't the best moment to push forward an agenda of technocracy. Different interests at the moment. And okay, so then he also in 1932 he co-founded the Commission for Technocracy, which was another institution. So he was just trying to push forward that agenda in every occasion he could literally. But the times weren't aligned for him to, and for his friends here to actually take that to reality. Now, once he became the chief of technical division, NYCHA, he started to kind of experiment with those notions in a much more real way, right? So we have already seen how he tackled the issues of sunlight and ventilation, etc., and density in what kind of very technical and very mathematical way. And now what we're looking here is a very interesting and very relevant, we think, also derivative project, which is about not just site planning, but kind of demographic, the demographic planning of the city. Also very important in terms of density, right? So when he became the head of the technical division, together with William Ballard, his assistant, one of the first things they did is they produced this internal report, which was never published as far as we know, which is called the population in New York City as permitted by the zoning and multiple dwelling laws. So in it, they basically revealed and kind of ridiculed and criticized the gargantuan population that the 1916 zoning resolution potentially allowed, right? Because in their view, the 1916 zoning resolution was just allowed an incredible density. And so they came up with these numbers where they find out that if developed, at a maximum level, the city under that zoning laws could achieve as many as 70 million people and a density, overall average density of 1,300 people per acre. Let me recall that, just remind you that the density of tenements, I don't know if we mentioned this before in this talk, but the density of tenements could be as high as 1,100, 1,200, something like that. So this was the density that was potentially possible under the 1916 zoning resolution. So they also drew these diagrams where they showed, kind of what they thought was kind of a monstrous possible result of just taking the maximum bulk allowed and developing Ballard. This kind of died there at the moment. As far as we know, it didn't get published. It wasn't, didn't give way to new another development of that until, we found the document. It actually exists in every library, of course, but it's not within a very well-known document at all. So all the numbers that they made, as you see, technocracy is really rooted here. And this is Ballard again, that I was mentioning, was his colleague at the moment and co-authored that report. And interestingly, by 1950, Ackerman had died 1 or 2 years before. But Ballard, who at the moment was not working for NYCHA anymore, he had a private, he had a firm, was commissioned by NYCHA, not by NYCHA, by city planning, to make a report kind of informing or proposing new ideas for new zoning resolution, right? So he and his colleagues at his firm, Harrison, Ballard, and Allen, were the three. He made this plan for rezoning the city of New York, where they basically took the report that they had made, that Ackerman and Ballard had made in 1934, and made it more beautiful, developed it a little bit, but basically the idea is the same, that the zoning at that moment allowed just developing something like this into something like this, which they thought was monstrous and completely out of scale. And so they, instead of that, they proposed something very different. So what they did is they thought, they started from the density point of view. They thought of a certain population that they thought was kind of suitable for the city in a range of 20 years. So they thought this was the 50s, so they thought in the 1970s the city can be and will probably be around 8.5 million people. And then they thought the city will probably stabilize there. It will stay around that, because that's as much dense as it can get. We don't want it to be denser, and it will probably not get denser. So they started out there, and then they thought what was the minimum floor area that a person needed. And so by some calculations, right, they decided that they had that amount of population and that amount of floor area per person. They would calculate the total residential floor area that the city needed. And so they did that, also thinking about families, kind of demographically very thought of. They ended up with a specific number of square feet. And so that was what the city should be able to develop. Now, the concept, the notion behind that was kind of, was very new and had never been applied that way. It was called floor area ratio, sorry, FAR. So that was a concept which was kind of, had been mentioned sometimes in previous reports and literature that we find, but had never really been thought through in this way as really an actual viable mechanism to control the bulk and the development of an entire city. So it is indirectly controlling the bulk of the city. It's not directly setting a certain volume or height, but it's indirectly controlling the bulk, and it is actually downzoning the city by a lot through this particular zoning device. And this, we think, is not the origin, the first moment in history when this notion was kind of embedded into zoning this way. Interestingly, Ballard became the chairman of City Planning Commission just a few years after the 1961 zoning resolution had adopted all kind of the suggestions that the earlier report made. So the zoning is finally changed according to the principles that Ballard, together with Ackerman, had developed as early as 1934, and while they were working for public housing. So it's kind of going from housing back to zoning and actually applying that housing reform mindset finally to the zoning of the entire city. Also, he liked cars. This is an interview by a very young Alois Huxtable. So he ended up being the chairman of the City Planning Commission, and this is the zoning that we have today. This is kind of very relevant to the present too, right? Also, finally, polo grounds. The rendering that I showed at the very beginning of my talk was designed by Ballard. So there is kind of a trace that we can follow. We can trace back all these ideas, these projects, through real people, and kind of see the sense of quality, and that's part of what the exhibition is trying to explain and hopefully start to. So that's it.
Do you have any questions?
Just fascinating, thank you. And, I was particularly struck by the image around the back of this wall, the design silhouettes called people per acre. And, it's so, I think that's so counterintuitive. You see the taller buildings and,
the diagrams are on the
Yeah,
side.
the diagrams.
Leo made those.
Yeah.
He designed them.
They're here too. They're
Yeah.
around here too. Yeah.
And it's so counterintuitive to me to think about this kind of planned density reduction. And that's what one of the big ideas I got out of tonight. But you stopped at 61, and when you and I had talked, there have been all these corrective measures since 61 to move away from the strict tower in the park model to back to higher lot coverage, still with FARs, but some trying to think more about how the buildings relate to the street. That's been kind of this odyssey from 61 through today.
I think we discussed this some, but I think there have been amazing sort of updates and changes and zonings and things like that. But I think one thing that comes through definitely in the show is the power of these ideas. Right? I mean, they're so influential, and so in a way, the language, whether it's the technocratic language or analysis, or the vision of the project as it was, right? That these were such powerful ideas that I think it's very hard for you in planning and other areas to push back against this idea that low density is better, right, than high density, because we had decades and decades, right, of indoctrination, whether it was in the era of tenement house reform or NYCHA, right? That lower density created a higher quality of life for people, and Fred French was dead, he was gone, right? And it was the whole. We've talked about this, and when we get towards the exhibition, the whole country was going low density, right? I mean, you're swimming in New York City, you're swimming against, right, decentralization, of 100 years, right, and culturally, right? So it's not just that, it happens internally in New York in terms of culture of Frederick Ackerman. And Frederick Ackerman didn't really even have to argue for low density as a starting point, because all of America believes lower density is better, right? I know there's planners and a few other people who are different, but I think that's sort of the challenge, right? Is that they came up with a powerful vision, and then they exist within a society which is very suspicious, right, of density. Very dense living environments.
But on the density question, how important was Jane Jacobs' book, The Death and Life, in terms of,
We'd like to say she was more important, but for the period we're looking at, and you can answer this too, but 61, their book comes out, but that's about the same time that zoning downzones the whole city, pulls tons of density out, operationalizes Ackerman's vision, a 30-year-old vision, right?
And what was Jane Jacobs' vision?
What's that?
So I get to answer
Go ahead.
answer that question, because I wrote that panel over there about
Yes.
the critics, Jane
Yeah.
Jacobs
Yeah.
and Lawrence Halpern. So in Death and Life, chapter 11 is called The Need for Concentration, and it's a much underappreciated chapter. If you really analyze it, she goes through the whole history of reform movements in Garden City and the quantification of density of units or housing per acre, and then she finally does kind of have to come to the mat and say what she thinks is the optimal density, or the necessary density for a vital urban neighborhood, the kind that she's recommending for the variety and diversity of housing stock and building types and uses. And would you like to guess what that number is?
well, I did glance at your panel.
Okay.
Is it like 400 or 500?
500 people an acre.
500, yeah.
NYCHA's density is
Average.
Is around 250 to 275 for, let's say, the Harlem project. So if you go to Co-op City, it's 51.
Co-op City is 51.
Well, it's an enormous piece of land.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was just going to point out that although I don't trust it, the best number of what the current zoning can build is for a city of 9.6 million.
Interesting.
And as we're at a city at 8.6 million, and you never can get there, it explains a lot of the issues we're dealing with now.
Right, this legacy is alive and well, right?
Yeah,
And that's-
but it
and people
continued
yeah.
to drop from 61,
Right.
which was supposedly 12 million.
Well,
So I would say, if I were giving the Leo's talk in a much more histrionic way, that there's nothing more important than FAR. It governs our lives and the destiny of New York at this moment, and it was created in 1961 zoning. People who have been practicing it for decades don't know where it came from, and now we think we know where it came from.
yeah, and we're not happy.
It came from socialist houses in the 1930s. Right?
Right,
Social engineering.
right. And, you know,
Well, it
these,
is social engineering. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
It's a very reductive view of community, of urban life, and that's why Jane Jacobs, even more than the density figure she offers, that's why her critique was so powerful, right? That it's more than housing units stacked, you know,
Yeah.
in a certain place. There's all these other dimensions, but sadly, right? The people who had the levers, right, Ballard, right, who had the levers of power, you know, people will will sort of cite her here and there, but the truth is that all the lessons of technocracy and what Ballard and Ackerman had done, where it counted, they ended up in the zoning code. And so it's more
And
powerful.
Jane Jacobs was, in that chapter, absolutely opposed to standardization, which is the model of whether it's her sister lived in Stuyvesant Town. And the formulas by which, even names, the formulas by which housing is accomplished only through standardization. And she makes the arguments, the only way you can get to this density is by doing it this way, through the monotony, through the separation.
Right.
So she analyzed everything that we were talking about accurately. But she would have created, with the variety of massing and uses, a different kind of neighborhood, but she thought it was necessary to have 500 people an acre in order for those neighborhoods to be vital.
And what you've said sort of sparked in me, which is that standardization and that massive project idea is also one of the challenges, right? Because to have the Jane Jacobs type neighborhood, you need lots of different little projects. The big housing projects are 1,000, 1,500. I mean, Queensbridge is 3,500 apartments, right? So again, that vision, whatever we think of it today, right? In terms of delivering, right? It's a Fordist model of production, like it's an assembly line, right? And now we want everything kind of gourmet, like each project has to be individually developed in this very, sort of, I don't know. It's very design-based, there has to be a lot of community integration with it and so forth. And so it's very difficult to get those numbers back, right? Just in the same way in production.
Would she criticize London Terrace and Fred French's?
Where was she?
Jane
Jane
Jacobs.
Jacobs, she lived just down, a few blocks south of there. She didn't say specifically, and I think she would liked more variety, more classes, but I would say, just to underscore the kind of landscape of this talk, the most reductive thing that we were trying to do in the exhibition was to draw attention to density having two definitions. One is the population density and the other is lot coverage. And as Jane Jacobs said of population density, said that's the monstrosity of the average. Because you take the amount of area and then you divide the number of people, and that gives you the average, which is a monstrosity because it doesn't describe the experience of the place and the variety of architecture. But nevertheless, you can't have a vital neighborhood without density. She makes that point again and again, and yet we keep trying to do it.
Well, the other side, the other way sort of Jacobs is misread, right, is that she's against neighborhood change or increasing density in neighborhoods, right? That there's something so precious about a particular environment that it cannot be changed, right?
So that it's only low rise,
only
and so
low
it can
rise.
only be low density.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what do you believe caused the downfall of NYCHA and NYCHA developments that we know today? Is it just the dilapidated infrastructure that money hasn't been put up? Or do you think it's also from an engineering point of view or from a zoning point of
Engineering's
view?
fine. That's I've written a lot about that.
You're the guy, yeah. You don't know that.
How do you summarize? Well, I mean, obviously the funding is an issue. But just from a practical standpoint, these numbers that were created for these projects, I'll just give you a specific example to help you. And I've talked with people who are in the real estate industry, and their point about the NYCHA project, as large as they are, they just don't think they're large enough to be efficiently managed in a way. So they're actually in a weird way, because of the enormous costs of management now, they're too small for the amount of land they take up, and also it's not the land, it's for to maintain them. The elevators with the rents that they have. So, I mean, that's an issue. Because we haven't talked about this a lot, but, who was going to live in NYCHA projects was very different. There's your calculations were for kind of this aspiring working middle class, nuclear family, right? That was who public housing was built for. The projects were essentially viewed as, there were basically subsidies from the government for the construction of the projects, but the projects were essentially supposed to be self-funded through the rents of the tenants. And this was based on a different, and by the way, this continued to be the case in NYCHA even when it became a minority-dominated system in the late 1950s and early 1960s. But when public housing basically was asked and basically took on a broader social role as basically a kind of triage housing for people moving from homeless shelters, the very poor. There were certain decisions made at the federal level. All those calculations about what would work, right, as sort of family life in these places, that kind of went away because you weren't collecting enough income. Government never really came in with enough money to make up for that loss of rent, right? And then the other side of the NYCHA story is because it wasn't, after the 1930s, you know, it's not really community vision. You still the most popular projects at NYCHA, Williamsburg houses, Harlem River houses, these like, you know, walk-ups with stores. They're more integrated in the neighborhoods and things like that. They're actually more, I think, reasonable to maintain also because you don't have elevators and other issues like that. Because they, I think, sort of got rid of that community vision, when you had less money, when you had people who had basically more family issues and social issues, you know, the model of the, you know, independent living in a tower block with an elevator, you know, it doesn't work as well, right? It doesn't work as well. So there are a lot of reasons, but I wanted to say this: if somebody else has another way of offering $500 apartments in New York City, large $500 apartments with air, light, and open space around them, we all welcome your ideas, because anything that replaces NYCHA, as those of you who are at NYCHA know, right? It's not going to be as big. It's not going to be as airy and light. Maybe the neighborhoods might be more vibrant and interesting and more modern housing and so forth. But it's this vision. We keep coming back to this, but it's an extraordinarily powerful vision. It's difficult to alter these landscapes without undercutting the air and light, right? One sort of solution, and thank God, because you know this was the one solution, right? I think they're going to be, you know, even the Fulton project, for instance, includes some elements of private sector management of the existing renovation of the existing developments, some redevelopment, you know, some. So I would say that it's kind of good that these things are out in the public. You know, it's not Ackerman and Ballard, you know, back in a room coming up with the standards of the future. I mean, sort of think about that, right? There was no public consultation at all in the creation of NYCHA, right? They really didn't consult at all. And so now the transition is going to be longer, it's going to be more expensive, it'll take longer, but we'll probably end up with a better result for NYCHA because it's in the public rather than on a spreadsheet, like their early spreadsheet, you know, of how to do things. So I'm actually fairly optimistic that there will be solutions found, but it, by the way, took us 20, 30 years to get here. And you know, I always like to point out the public housing piece, these were people who'd spent 20, 30 years in the trenches already, right? So it's gonna take 20, 30 years to figure out what the future is in NYCHA. We don't want another, like, let's do it all now, right? I would suggest you don't want to rad everything now, you know, like put it all under private management. God knows what a mess that would be. Right? Because we don't know, with some managers will be good, some. So it's good to have the process, right? Because the process before was, let's sit down with our, you know, our slide rules, and we're gonna like redesign the city. I don't think that's the way to go.
I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. And if this is your first time here, you missed the first 14 years of our life in Vanity Park City because we opened in 2004. We do exhibitions on topics that range from New York's history, like this one, to history to contemporary towers to international skyscrapers to super talls around the world. But when we do shows, we love to indulge in our love of New York City history. And so this exhibition, which is called Housing Density, and you have your fans. I don't have a fan. Thank you. That gives you the overview idea, housing density from tenements to towers. It's the first time that we've really looked at residential architecture in the history of our 29 exhibitions with the museum. But doing that was a great refreshing experience for me in research. And I think it yielded some really interesting, for me at least, insights into the history of the development of New York. Now, our guest curator, one of them, Nicholas Bloom, with his colleague from New York Institute of Technology, Matthias Altwicker, who with the students at NYIT built the models that you see in the cases and the district models that you see on the tables, which have all moved over there for the exhibition, but you'll be able to experience them with their touch screens and everything. And in fact, every bit of text and image that is in the show you can find on our website now. So you can explore the rather voluminous text of the essays and the narrative of an overview of housing in New York from tenements to towers. And when Nick and Matt came to me with the idea of doing some kind of show on density, it was on the heels of a previous exhibition that they had done called Affordable Housing in New York. And as I introduced Nick, I can hold up only 3 of the many books that he's written. This is the most recent one, just out, and he did an author's talk a couple of months ago when it just came out, How States Shaped Post-War America. Nick is an urban historian and a scholar of public policy. He will just be leaving New York Institute of Technology and going to Hunter for in a tenured professorship there, so he'll start a kind of new career and with a bunch of new colleagues, but working on many of the same issues. And it was a real pleasure to be able to work with someone with as great a knowledge of New York City's housing history as Nick has. In fact, this book gives really the key to the background and the thesis of this exhibition, Public Housing That Worked, which is about the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA. And you notice that the title has the verb in the past tense, public housing that worked. But Nick is an advocate of public housing. He can also be a critic of it. He has a quick mind and a facility for looking at material and digesting material that made this exhibition a real joy for me to work on. And as we were working at the museum with our staff, our other speaker for tonight, Leo Tamargo, who has just graduated from, is an architect, has just come to New York from Spain for the program at Columbia in critical and curatorial studies. So it was a perfect opportunity and a perfect topic for Leo to be able to work on the graphics for this exhibition, but also the graphics of the history of the graphics of density, and that's some of what he's going to talk about tonight. So this is research which really hasn't been done before, and it really is academic investigation on both levels, in the history of housing, but also in the presentation of some of these key figures and how they presented the materials. It's really new research, and so we wanted to make sure that we got it down on film tonight. This thesis that Nick has developed in his books and in this exhibition has a short 2 sentences that I'd like to read here, because I kept asking Nick, and we had a lot of fun doing the show, but I kept asking him, okay, what is the big idea here? And we would have these meetings in our office. What is the big idea? Because I think both of us have a tendency to bury the lead in our, kind of the conclusion of what our, academic investigations are. And so for that panel right there, which is on the big wall on Queensbridge and Stuyvesant Town, the summary of the 1930s initiation of the New York City Housing Authority, the birth of this idea about social housing that was made possible by the Depression and by funds that came from the federal government as well as the state and the local governments eventually, established a new model. And that model, so Nick wrote, New York's leaders pioneered a revolutionary vision of urban living, large-scale, master-planned, high-rise, low-density apartment communities. The success of these plans set the city on a path to density reduction in the decades that followed. And I think the key insight of this exhibition and kind of in the broad overview of the history of New York contradicted our initial thoughts about where this show would go, because we wanted to advocate for high density. We wanted to explore density in New York and how it compared with urbanisms in other major capitals of the world. we had looked in previous exhibitions at Hong Kong, which is in many ways a place which is very similar to New York because they use vertical density in the same way that we do. It was clear, and Nick will talk about, the trajectory from tenements to towers, which is the subtitle of the exhibition, that the dynamic, that impulse that was coming from the housing reform movement was to take the overcrowded slums and to create from that some kind of reform. And the thesis that occurred to me in the process of understanding NYCHA better through Nick was the opportunity of the Depression in order to create this new model. And that is essentially tonight's lecture, is to take the 1930s and the predicate to the 1930s, but the birth of NYCHA in the 1930s, which we call Prodigy of the Depression, and explore it in detail. And then Leo will talk about his research of a figure that became our favorite son out of this research, Frederick L. Ackerman, and his protege, William Ballard, who ended up being enormously consequential in the development of the housing model that was early NYCHA, and then established the lineage to the tower in the park solution that we see in the whole reshaping of the post-war landscape of New York and Manhattan, but certainly very significantly in the outer boroughs. So that's what we're going to explore tonight. So I've already introduced Nick a little bit with his academic affiliations and some of his many books, which are like 9 or 10 now. And he also writes, he writes a lot of different things. He co-edits the Journal of Urban History. And Leo is, as I said, an architect and just recently graduated from Columbia, and an excellent designer, as you can see from the walls of this exhibition. So.